Welcome to this World Sociology screencast on counter-industrial theories. Now this heading, counter-industrial theories, is in fact an umbrella term that encompasses a whole range of perspectives that are critical of the Western industrial model of development. So for example, on the one hand we've got environmentalism, which is critical of the impact of rapid industrialization on the natural environment, and then we've got neopopulism, which is critical of the impact of Western development on traditional cultures and people's sense of well-being. And then this term, people-centered development, is used to describe the types of development policies that are proposed by counter-industrial theories. And later on in the presentation, we'll look at two concrete examples of people-centered development. Environmentalism is very critical of the Western industrial model of development because it argues that environmental damage is intrinsic to this model of development. So this perspective argues that Western development leads to uncontrolled ecological damage through effects such as degradation of the biosphere, as factories emit pollution, depletion of finite natural resources, and a loss of biodiversity. So this perspective argues that the Earth cannot support the Western lifestyle universally, that this would simply take us well beyond the carrying capacity of planet Earth. And environmentalists argue that we need a new paradigm for development, one that doesn't treat the planet as simply a subsystem of finance and the economy, and instead puts sustainable development and conservation of the planet's finite resources at the heart of development. As the economist Kenneth Baldwin argues, anybody who believes in infinite growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. And environmentalists would argue that the effects of things like climate change are potentially devastating for developing countries. So we can see in this image two maps of Uganda, and Uganda's main export at the moment is coffee, and at the moment these areas are the areas that are suitable for the cultivation of that crop. However, with an increase in temperatures in Uganda of just 2 degrees, you can see that there would be very few areas, just the mountainous areas of Uganda, that would be suitable for this cultivation of coffee. Another type of counter-industrial theory is a perspective called neopopulism. So neopopulism highlights the way in which rapid industrialization doesn't just harm the environment, it also has human costs. So it can lead to unemployment, it can break up traditional communities, it can undermine local cultures, and it can create a dependency on the Northern Hemisphere for technology and parts. Now at the beginning of the presentation I mentioned that the types of policies associated with these perspectives come under the heading of people-centered development. And there are two principles that inform people-centered development. One is the idea that the majority world should learn from the mistakes of the minority world and not repeat them. And this is linked to the idea of sustainable development, that the Western model is damaging to the environment, whereas sustainable development is defined as that which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the second key principle is this idea that development should help people on the ground by improving what they already do rather than replacing their lifestyle and their technologies with a Western model. So the mantra of improving rather than replacing is at the heart of people-centered development. And I think the Buddhist economist Schumacher encapsulates those principles with his concept of intermediate technologies, which has had a big impact on development policy, particularly through the activities of the NGO Practical Action. And intermediate technologies are relatively low-cost, low-tech innovations that are sustainable, that are based on local materials that nevertheless have a big impact on development. Let me just give you one simple example. What we can see in this image is an African cooking their meal using the traditional cooking method in most of Africa. This is what we call a freestone fire. And there are a number of problems with this traditional cooking method. One problem is the indoor air pollution. And this, the World Health Organization argues, is a serious health problem. And then secondly, because this is an open fire, it's not a very efficient cooking method. So people need to gather a lot of firewood. That takes up a lot of their time. And then the demand for firewood can cause deforestation. And this can lead to soil erosion. And in the case of this area of Uganda, featured in this newspaper headline, mudslides that wiped out entire villages. And what we can see in this next image is an intermediate technology solution to the problem of the open, inefficient freestone fire. So this is a fuel-efficient stove made out of local mud. We can see that it's much more efficient because it's enclosed, and you can also cook using 2 pots. And there's also here a vent to help with the problem of indoor air pollution. So this is a relatively low cost, low tech, but sustainable innovation that can potentially have a big impact. And therefore it's a good concrete example of Schumacher's idea of an intermediate technology. And then a second important initiative derived from people-centered approaches is the provision of small loans or microcredit to people who would otherwise be unable to access credit to invest in businesses. And in practice this has meant that microcredit has particularly targeted poor women. However, critics argue that approaches such as microcredit can only have a limited impact. The loans are meant to help poor people to either start their own business or develop their own business, but because the loans are relatively small, it doesn't give entrepreneurs the opportunity to really develop their business from, maybe a small one-person business to a medium-sized business that could employ other people. And furthermore, loans are often taken out not to invest in a business, but for other forms of consumption. So for example, people might take out a microcredit loan when there's a family wedding or a family funeral, for example, and that of course defeats the purpose of microcredit.